All right, we're going to finish off our World War II series first by talking about the science and technology of war. World War II was different from previous wars throughout human history. And number one, the vast number of refugees that were generated during the war was unprecedented. And reason number two was the enormous death toll. So, World War II resulted in the deaths of between 60 to 80 million people. And that includes, obviously, military casualties, but that also includes the number of civilian casualties. And more civilians died as prisoners of war than actual soldiers did. Because what you're looking at are victims of the Holocaust, you're looking at victims of total war. And this number of deaths is more than any of the conflicts in the 20th and 21st century combined. The scale of human suffering during the war was due to a change in moral values and to the appearance of new technology in warfare. Science had a significant impact on the technology during World War II, and that can be seen in the application of scientific discoveries to produce synthetic rubber, radar developments, new developments in cryptanalysis and antibiotics, the development of aircraft and missiles, and the US government organization of physicists and engineers to produce atomic weapons. During this time period, one weapon that was not used during the war was chemical warfare. And chemical weapons were used in concentration camps. Let's not forget that. On the actual battlefield, chemical weapons were not allowed. And that decree was actually put in by Adolf Hitler because during World War I, he was actually the victim of chemical warfare and went blind. However, he did gain his vision back. And I hate to use the word victim when I speak of Adolf Hitler, but he did go blind while he was a soldier in World War I. During the war, you will see new types of airplanes. What's interesting is that in World War II, planes from World War I were actually used by Russian women. They were called the Night Witches. And the reason they were called the Night Witches is because in World War II, they are flying planes from during and just after World War I. These planes are very, very loud. And just to give you an idea of how bad tookis these women were, they would have to turn off the plane when they were flying over Germany. And they're basically free falling, gliding down, dropping bombs. And they were called night witches because you could not hear them coming until the bombs were already falling. These women would then have to climb out of the plane to start the propellers again, climb back in, and then fly off. About 300 of these women died during World War II, but that just goes to show you the extreme lengths that countries went to during the war and trying to attack. The Night Witches, that was the German nickname for these women. They were the 588th Regiment, but most historians don't teach that in classes, which I think is an absolute shame because it's definitely worth mentioning. The bombing raids, in addition to the Night Witches from the USSR. Massive bombing raids were incredibly intense and resulted in the deaths of unparamounted numbers of people. You're talking women, children, the elderly, infants, animals, people's pets. The British and Americans relied heavily on bombing raids, and they were intended not only to strike individual buildings, but to break the morale of the civilian population. And massive bombing raids on German cities caused substantial casualties, and it severely impacted Germany's ability to transport oil and to manufacture synthetic fuels. German armament production continued to increase until late 1944, and the German people remained obedient and hardworking despite what was happening. And Japanese cities with their wooden buildings also became the targets of American bombing raids. Fire bombs devastated Japanese cities. The firebombing of Tokyo in March of 1945 killed 80,000 people and left a million homeless. So, what you see here, this is actually a memorial to Kaiser Wilhelm I, and it was partially destroyed, but it's been left as a monument. These are victims from the bombing of Berlin, simply laid out, waiting for identification, and these are people cleaning up after one of the bombings. The next thing we're going to discuss is the Holocaust. Nazi killings of civilians were part of the calculated policy of exterminating whole races of people. German Jews were deprived of their citizenship and legal rights, and they were herded into ghettos, and many died of starvation and disease. This became common practice in all countries that the Nazis invaded, particularly in Poland. There will be a large number. The most famous would be the Warsaw Ghetto. In early 1942, the Nazis decided to apply modern industrial methods to slaughter the Jewish population in Europe, and thus began building concentration camps like Auschwitz, Treblinka, Dachau, Bergen-Belsen. This mass extermination was called the Holocaust, and that means to burn whole. History has previously taught that the Holocaust resulted in the deaths of 6 million Jews and 5 million other people that the Nazis considered to be undesirable. And that includes Polish Catholics, homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, gypsies today are called Roma, and people who were disabled either intellectually or physically, all in the interest of racial purity. However, those numbers are changing. And one thing about the Nazis is they were fantastic record keepers. And what we do know, based on new technology available to us, on being able to use satellites to take photographs, is the number of concentration camps on record do not match the number of people who died. And for the reason the number of Jewish people prior to the Holocaust living in Europe, the numbers recorded, and the numbers after, something does not add up. And what many people believe now is that it's actually 11 million Jewish people killed during the Holocaust, not 6 million. And another reason to support that is, again, using satellites and new technology. There are dozens of small concentration camps where the foundations can still be seen in the earth. The actual buildings are gone. And historians, forensic anthropologists are working on this, partnering with archaeologists, and what they're finding are there are numerous smaller concentration camps that also resulted in the deaths of more people. So that's what they're working on now. But again, those numbers are changing from 11 million people killed in the Holocaust to 15 million people killed during the Holocaust. And that's just in the concentration camps that we're looking at, as well as the killings in the ghetto. There are some wonderful books out there. Night by Elie Wiesel, and actually the picture is small. That is him. This picture was taken in Auschwitz. That's where he spent time during the Holocaust. This picture was taken after the deaths of his mother, his younger sister, and then after his father was killed in the camp. His father was sick with cholera or dysentery, and was taken away during the night, and he never saw him again. The tattoos identifying survivors of the Holocaust, there are so many photographs of what happened. Children were not excluded from this. In addition to Night, another wonderful book is called Survival in Auschwitz by Livy Primo, and he was an Italian chemist. Unfortunately for Primo, he suffered from extreme survivor's guilt, and after the war, after writing his book, he could not handle surviving when so many people did not, and committed suicide when he was in his 70s by throwing himself down a flight of stairs. Survivor's guilt is not uncommon among the survivors. A graphic novel is called Maus, Maus, and it's written by the son of a Holocaust survivor. And he does discuss what it was like, his mother, and her battle with survivor's guilt as well. And by the way, I have all of these books if you are interested in borrowing them. Hitler defined the Slavs as an inferior race. And this inferior race was destined to work for the master race, the Aryans. He had defined two races as so inferior they served no purpose at all. And the Jews that had been segregated into ghettos and labor camps were immediately herded in. You would have multiple families living in a single house, and quite often there was no preparation time, meaning people who were herded into the ghettos would leave behind priceless treasures, family heirlooms. We're talking paintings, gold jewelry, silver, crystals. And some Jews did protest their fate. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising of 1943 is the most famous example. Unfortunately, this ghetto uprising did not work, and why it is the most famous, though, because the people living there were able to fight back. There were some deaths of Nazi soldiers, but after the uprising began, the Nazis came in and completely liquidated the entire camp. The U.S. refused to grant asylum to most refugees. And a big reason for that was prejudice against European Jews. And I do believe it's also worth mentioning that Anne Frank's father, Otto Frank, applied for asylum on multiple occasions, specifically to the cities of Boston, as well as multiple cities in Florida. And every time he applied, he was denied asylum. Even after it became apparent the Nazis were going to lose the war, they continued to try and exterminate Jews. And a big reason for that was to destroy and to burn the evidence of these atrocious crimes against humanity. After the AP exam, we will be watching Schindler's List. And it is a rather accurate portrayal of what was happening to these people living in the ghettos and living in the concentration camps. During World War II, the distinction between the front and the home front was blurred as rapid military movement and air power carried the war into people's homes. Armies swept through the land, confiscating anything of value. Bombing raids destroyed entire cities, and people were deported to die in concentration camps. Millions of people fled their homes in terror, leaving everything behind. And the U.S. was separated from the conflict by an ocean. The territory of Hawaii was the only area directly impacted and directly struck during the war. Continental U.S. was left alone for the reason that the war was too far away. So American citizens were at least protected from that. But that being said, European and Asian citizens certainly were not. In terms of prejudice and American citizens, Japanese Americans will be directly impacted and removed from their homes because of the bombings of Pearl Harbor, and we will talk about that in just a moment. The war demanded enormous and sustained efforts from all civilians. The Soviet Union and in the U.S., industrial workers were pressed to turn out tanks, ships, and other war material. In the Soviet Union and in other belligerent countries, mobilization of men from the military gave women significant roles in industrialization and agricultural production. And there you see, we can do it. That is Rosie the Riveter. Let's all fight, buy war bonds. Every bond you buy is a bullet in your best man's gun. If you watch Captain America, the speech that he gives when he's trying to sell war bonds is pretty much a word for word a typical speech. Marilyn Monroe got her start because she was working in a riveting factory helping to build airplanes when a photographer came in, noticed her, took her picture. That's how it all started. Unlike other countries involved in the war, the U.S. flourished. Its economy was stimulated by war production. Consumer goods were in short supply, so the American savings rate increased, laying the basis for the post war consumer boom that will be seen in the late 40s and into the 50s. The war weakened traditional ideas by bringing women, African Americans, and Mexican Americans into jobs once reserved solely for white men. Migrations of African Americans north and west and of Mexican immigrants to the southwest resulted in the overcrowding and discrimination in the industrial cities. Japanese Americans were rounded up and herded into internment camps because of their ethnicity. They were forced to leave everything behind, their homes, their businesses, friends, and forced to live in camps much like this. And what I wanted to show you, and I'm sorry this is not a bit more high tech, is this. George Takei on his memories of World War II as a Japanese American. If you're interested in watching that, the link is attached to the PowerPoint. I did have the absolute privilege of attending a speaking engagement with George Takei, and he spent quite a bit of time talking about what it was like. And the quote from him, "My family and I spent years in the prison camps because we happened to look like the people who bombed Pearl Harbor. It's my life's mission to never let such a thing happen again in America." And that needs to be all of our missions, to never let that happen again. Total War, I've talked about extensively throughout the podcast, and I will talk about it again because the total war was tremendously high when it came to civilians. The Holocaust alone killed over 60% of the pre-war Jewish population. All nations involved used radio, film, and print media for campaigns of propaganda, as well as spreading misinformation. And Hitler's Nazi regime was famous for their propaganda. One of my favorite professors from Mansfield University, his name was Dr. Gaskovich, and his specialty was World War II, specifically Nazi propaganda. And he actually taught a class on it, just on propaganda alone from the Holocaust. Americans sacrificed quite a bit for the war, but also benefited economically from it. And the Soviet Union also mobilized their entire population for the war, but because of the German invasion, much of their population suffered horrifically. In the rest of Western Europe, the war had an immediate impact on daily lives, and European culture was changed by the war. Specifically, European values, both traditional for gender roles as well as social values. The war made the U.S. willing to take a more active role in international politics, even though they were separated by an ocean from the conflict. In Japan, few citizens experienced the war firsthand until 1944. After Japan was defeated, Britain wanted to liberate the former colonies by returning them to British rule. Civilians in Asia experienced the war in a very harsh way. For many Asian civilians, the war meant famine and shortages of medicine. The British were surprised that the Indian National Congress and Gandhi refused to assist the British Empire. In response, the Congress demanded that Britain leave India immediately as part of the Quit India campaign. Arabs were also disturbed by how the British handled the war in Africa and the Middle East. Britain's African colonies were the most supportive of the British war effort. The King's African Rifles were recruited in Nigeria and Kenya. But experience in the war also taught Africans about self-determination. Africans in French colonies supplied soldiers for Charles de Gaulle's Free French Army. During the Depression, construction industry had slowed down, reducing environmental stress. The war reduced this trend. One source of environmental stress was the damage caused by war itself. But the main cause was not the fighting, but the economic development, mining, industry, and logging that was stimulated by the war. And in our conclusion, just take a minute to review our key points. If you have any questions, send me an email. Take a little bit just to let it all sink in, let it digest. It's not always the easiest topic, World War II, and the atrocities against humans that were committed, but it's important that we know it so we don't let it happen again. Have a nice night, guys.